Maslow's hierarchy of needs pyramid that we were to draw in respect to privacy infringements of ordinary Indians, FRT is going to rank somewhere lower than the ability to track our messages, the ability to get basic biometric information, the abilities to get basic financial information about all of us at the click of a button, so on and so forth, and our health data. Let's not even go there.
Hi, I'm Joanne.
Hi, I'm Nidhi.
And welcome to the CCG Tech Podcast.
Hi, Abhinav. It's great to have you on the podcast, and we're so excited to talk to you about facial recognition today. So recently in the news, I've been hearing a lot about facial recognition. There was, I think, a lot of talk about a university in Canada that was using facial recognition in its vending machines, and a lot of pushback that followed the use of facial recognition without disclosing it to the students. This is something that a lot of people have been wondering about, and I know that this is something that you've been working on, especially in the context of FRT in India. So I think it'd be great if you could start by just telling us about yourself, telling us about your work and what work you're doing specifically around FRT right now.
Thanks, Nidhi. Thanks for having me, and lovely to see you again. I am practicing law in Delhi. I've been doing this for quite a few years now, and in terms of the FRT litigation specifically, some of my work is with this organization that I'm sure you're familiar with, and I'm sure that people who look into this podcast will probably be familiar with it. It's called the Internet Freedom Foundation, and big shout out to IFF, Team IFF. But so IFF takes a lead on several important issues through its litigation vertical, which I assist with in my capacity as an off-counsel there. It was through IFF that we got a chance to file not one, but at present 2 active petitions across different high courts. We offer assistance to people who want to litigate these issues. So there is a petition that is pending before the Telangana High Court. There is a petition that is pending before the Madras High Court. In both, one is a public interest litigation and the other one is a writ petition. So the second one, the Madras petition, is involving a petitioner, someone who was subjected to what he believes facial recognition tech. And that's actually, and I'll come to that in a little bit as to the interesting answers that we received in pursuit of that litigation. So that's some really interesting stuff, opening up quite a big can of worms, possibly. So let's see where that leads us. But both these matters are as yet to be properly heard. The Madras one is still pending at the stage of pleadings. The other one, the older one, pleadings stand complete, but because of COVID, the entire litigation system across the country was thrown into a fair deal of disarray, and it's taking a little bit of effort to get matters, off the ground again, especially any case that has largely like a public interest element that in some parts is not really top priority because, people are dying. So you can respect those choices. So where we are at is that, again, these aren't the only petitions on FRT. There are others as well. And according to us, at least, and according to me, I don't think no high court has yet actually considered or decided these issues. But I think over the next couple of years, I think by 2025, we will possibly have the first verdicts insofar as India is concerned. Whether or not that will be too late is again something that we could probably come to win this conversation.
Thanks, Abhinav, for joining us today. Just picking off of some of the points you said on the petitions that are happening and that you've been involved with. I'm sure that the petitions deal with various applications of FRT, and so we were hoping that maybe you can talk to us about the purposes for which FRT is being used and what FRT looks like in some of these instances, and just your experience with how FRT is being used in India as well. Yeah, maybe you can speak to us a little bit about like the use of it.
So I have bad news there in the sense that both the petitions that we've had a chance to take to court are focused on the police usage of FRT for patrolling purposes or investigative purposes. But your question's a great seg to sort of expand that conversation and talk about what other areas are we seeing FRT in. An interesting thing that we came across again a few years ago was the potential usage of CCTV cameras and FRT in educational settings. It began obviously in election settings, and given that the elections are soon upon us, it will again be interesting to see what different states do on that matter. Famously, it was, if I'm not wrong, either Andhra Pradesh or Telangana which had suggested that we will deploy FRT as a means to prevent voter fraud. And again, that sort of did not fully took off a little bit, no one really knows. Our petitions looked at specifically the implementation of FRT in existing cameras that were there across the city and its linkage with an app-based sort of technology that local police were being provided, where they could take a photograph and it would, according to what we were told, again, that's the lack of transparency makes it difficult to make accurate guesses as to exactly how the tech works. But from reasonable guesses, the tech works in this manner, at least on the policing front, that the local police on the ground have an app in which they feed whatever image that they take. There is a database against which that image is compared, and that then gives you some sort of an answer depending on the level to which the match feature has been set. So if it is a very high threshold for matching a photograph with an existing photograph in the database, the likelihood of matches automatically reduces. Again, we don't know what that threshold is set at. So today, let's say if my face is being captured and being run against a database, the technology essentially identifies every face as per data points. And depending on how high or low we set the match threshold, that will determine how many matches we get with the database. So my face might have 12 data points that match with most people. But if it has 20 unique data points, probably only a select few photographs will have a complete match, right? So all of this is something that we have raised in the petitions, that number one, there is a complete lack of transparency insofar as how we decide what is going to be the threshold, how we implement it, how we administer it. And by we, I mean generally the executive machinery, which ought to do this with some level of transparency, is at least what our contention is. But there's not much that we've got as a result, so far at least. In respect of other tools, again, we aren't in court in Delhi, but it was interesting to see that even when the G20 meet was happening in Delhi this past September, again, the usage of FRT and AI tools to deal with patrolling was gathering a lot of media attention. And usually it's always very positive media attention, which I'm sure you guys have an entire sort of school of thought dedicated to look at as to how usually anything in policing that has the words technology is automatically seen in that light of being a good thing, whereas may not otherwise be seen so. So if we look at the representations of technology in the media, with FRT, we saw a lot of coverage around its possible usage. Again, we don't know if it was used or not, but possible usage when the G20 meet was going around in Delhi, where the police were reporting that there was going to be FRT and AI tools as part of its arsenal to deal with all sorts of problems that may or may not arise. As we know, nothing really happened, thankfully. But again, what was interesting is there was no questioning about all of this. There was this latent acceptance in all of the media reportage that was around this issue that, okay, yes, we will use FRT. Rather, so much so that we should use FRT. without really raising any questions as to what is it that you're signing up for, what is the technology really entail, and what kinds of issues are you creating. For instance, what about it being a legacy feature that you're installing in whatever cameras that you're using, right? So G20 might be the reason why you introduced it, but surely G20 is going to end in 3 days, but that FRT tech is going to stay in those in that hardware for much longer. So again, there was very little critical engagement with any of this. And again, from if you look at anything insofar as Delhi CCTV is concerned, Delhi is probably one of the most surveilled cities in the world today, and I'm sure that FRT forms a significant chunk of surveillance in the diplomatically sensitive parts of town.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very interesting point, and I definitely want to get back to our conversation about the kind of harms that like FRT has in terms of like the legacy that it'll leave behind and the kind of future potential it has. But another thing that you touched upon is just how different the journey of FRT is, even in just amongst the different states. So I remember that Delhi was one of the places where they were trying to deploy FRT in classrooms, and then there are states like Telangana that you said that are also trying to use FRT. There was also some calls for certain states trying to use FRT to see if women were looking scared at some point. And like I think just the general sort of uses that are being imagined for FRT right now are so different, and they're all being handled by high courts. So how do you see it being handled, like in terms of like, are you looking for some sort of a centralized way to deal with FRT? Some sort of like a centralized policy or a court opinion?
No, so it's interesting that you mentioned centralized policy, and that can take me to one of the responses that we received as part of the litigation exercises. At least one state responded by telling us that FRT's use is legalized through central law, which is the new Criminal Procedure Identification Act of 2022 that came in to replace the Identification of Prisoners Act of 1920. And we were informed by the state police in one state that the central law actually has completely legalized using any technology for any purpose to do with crime prevention. And so under the color of this power, FRT is being deployed, and rather continues to be deployed. So it will be interesting to see how that works out, because historically the Identification of Prisoners Act was always a means to deal with solving crime rather than preventing it, if you get what I mean. Prevention was part of it, most definitely, by having a register or by having some sort of identification means, but not active prevention in the sense that you are sort of creating a tech version of a buddy cop that is in real time running databases to check everything. And I think when you mention centralization in this conversation, you can't have that conversation without referring to something called the CCTNS, and that's basically again a centralized database that has been built for more than a decade now. So it's a pan-governmental measure, if we were to call it that. Like separate governments across time and space have found the validity of having this sort of a measure, which at the central level is creating a repository of data pertaining to anyone who has an FIR against them. So what if you take a step back from just the FRT questions and think about databasing generally, which is again a key feature of how FRT works. Databasing has been slowly but surely a very integral part of how governments across space and time since the last sort of quarter century have looked at policing. And if you then move from that premise, that databasing was happening completely outside the shadow of law. There was no right to privacy formally recognized before 2017. None of the legislation covering criminal law procedure investigations was dealing with databasing beyond very sort of rudimentary primitive police rules that used to be there, and that used to sort of provide you with explanations as to how you're going to maintain registers for habitual offenders. And that really is, that's as analog as you can get in the digital world, and those analog regulations never really held true. With that databasing at the central level, we then move into the FRT realm, where the key component of having pre-existing databases with photographs, with identifiers, was already there at a massive level. And so what you have is a grand fait accompli, right? No court or no government is now going to come and say don't use it, after having sponsored it in one way, shape or form for nearly a quarter century. And then on top of that, you just get FRT, which is doing what? Essentially, it is taking that existing database and allowing you to compare in real time what you have or have not captured on the ground. So right now, the big problem in terms of different states doing it differently is that you do see that states in which the CCTV movement was much more advanced, where let's say some states like Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh and Telangana had laws at the state level talking about mandatory enforcement of CCTV in public spaces. So you have that. You have Delhi, where Section 144 orders under the CRPC were being used as a way to install CCTV cameras across the city. So you have those areas where you already had the hardware set up, making it easier to get FRT in place, which ultimately is a technological measure relying upon that hardware in some form. So that distinction definitely is going to persist, because I think that level of inequality is just there across states, and which is why I think FRT is not going to gather national level prominence, because it is going to be confined to metros. It's going to be confined to parts where you have police that are more tech savvy. Like an outlier probably is going to be Indore, where the great work by folks at CPAP showed that Indore police are sort of going really heavy on tech and creating tech centers to sort of deal with enforcement. So again, you'll have outliers, but largely I foresee that FRT will remain a metro's sort of problem. What will be interesting though is the use of the central law to do all of this. So like I mentioned, the 2022 central law is being referred to, at least by some states, as the legal basis for FRT, which according to us, at least in our petitions, has no legal basis. So given that some states are actively citing this as the legal basis, it will be interesting to see what does the central government do with it, because how the 2022 legislation works is that practically everything is delegated to the rulemaking authority. That rulemaking authority has further subdelegated it to this body called the NCRB, the National Crime Records Bureau. And so today, frankly, we're all waiting to see what the NCRB comes up with. While again, there are different petitions that are pending in court as to whether this law is valid or not. Keeping that aside, today there's just again a gap as to what is or what is not the case. So yeah, I don't know if I fully answered your question, but I think it's somewhere there.
No, definitely. I think that was very useful context, and also the bit that you ended with on there being a gap, and I think that's an important part of this conversation, even just in terms of thinking about what regulation could potentially look like. But just one thing that you covered at the beginning and then just throughout about the objective of using FRT largely seems to be identification, but that's not the only sort of goal. And I was just wondering if there are other kinds of uses that FRT has, and how that can cross over from what it is being used for right now into sort of illegal or harmful uses. If you could maybe talk a little bit about that.
So again, I think identification itself has the great potential to become harmful, and I think the example of the UK is good here to sort of go into that jurisdiction, the UK was one of the first countries. If I think they say it is the first place which actually got a decision, but again I'm not sure if that's true or not. But one of the cases that was the first to deal with FRT certainly came out of the UK. It was a litigation around usage of FRT to check protesters and like putting FRT in public spaces and creating databases of people knowingly involved in protests in the past. So this one person, Ed Bridges, went with that litigation that was obviously assisted by various organizations involved, including, if I'm not wrong, Liberty, which is a very prominent organization in the UK dealing with issues of privacy and personal liberty. So in Bridges, you saw how police can use FRT to cast a chilling effect on the rights of assembly, on the rights of association, and on the right to protest. And again, it was only because of sustained efforts that even that information came out in the public, that you had a database where you had people on that database only because they had a history of going to protests, right? So what that did was, once that information came out in the public, you as a person who had this desire or this burning urge to speak up, now know that you're being watched. Not only are you being watched on the day, but there is a record that is going to be there, which is going to be used whenever the government wishes that it wants to do so. So the chilling effect was an argument that I felt was pretty convincing, and I feel that is probably the first and foremost argument and issue that will present itself as more and more FRT usage becomes known in India. And from whatever little we have seen, it was being utilized to deal with protests here as well. And again, we don't know as to what is on that database. Like, for instance, how did the police decide what was the parameter to make the database in the first place? So is that only being made on the basis of people who have convictions against them? Is that being made on the basis of a list? Is that being made on the basis of someone who has any criminal record? I don't know. And until there is a level of transparency in how that databasing works, I think that the chilling effect is quite drastic. Equally, I think that exposes the other harms that FRT will have, because one big issue that, let's say, has come up with usage of FRT in the United States and various parts of the United States is inherent bias in the technology in terms of how the identification mechanisms are working, where you have higher rates for people belonging to certain racial and ethnic backgrounds as opposed to others. And it is not very difficult for you to imagine similar concerns if the technology is rolled out aggressively in India, where you already have biases in enforcement of criminal law by the police driven across racial ethnic lines. So I think more and more usage of FRT is going to probably, and this is again from whatever we have seen across other jurisdictions, FRT is probably not going to throw that many new challenges. Like, when I say new, I mean completely new, hitherto unknown challenges. FRT in the hands of police, I mean. What FRT in the hands of police is probably going to throw up is a serious magnification of previously held biases in the police forces, in terms of who they think ought to be targets of patrolling, of surveillance, and of coercive measures. So the worry with technology that builds on databasing like FRT is going to be just that magnification of seriously problematic biases that certainly exist. And again, there's a lot of literature on that. So not very new, but definitely a heightened problem.
I think you cover a lot of how FRT is being used used by states, used in like the public sector, and I think some of those harms that you covered are extremely important to keep in mind. But I was wondering also if you could maybe speak a little bit about how some of these harms can even come about from private sector use, and even just what some of that private sector usage could look like.
I think the examples that we have so far all come from the United States in this regard, where the private sector has taken a big lead in terms of developing, using, and rolling out FRT across various contexts. I think to deal with that question, let's just first take a step back and do what I think I should have done at the start. But I mean, I think it's better late than never. And again, go into the detail a little bit as to how FRT is going to work, which I'm sure people who listen to your stuff know like much more comprehensively than I do. But it's important to consider when we look at the private sector's role in all of this. So what FRT is going to rely upon is obviously the database, which we've spoken a lot about already. The key ingredient after the database is going to be the technology that is going to do the identification and matching. And that identification and matching technology is going to be built on how the programming has fed identification to the tool, right? So in terms of what data points are you breaking a face into, how many are going to result in a match, what are you prompting as matches, what are you not prompting as matches, so on and so forth. I think the problems that you have seen in the private sector thus far are largely in terms of the manner in which that matching exercise is being provided in the software. Again, all of this is slightly moot today in the sense that a lot of these organizations, at least the big ones, have publicly said that, until we have more data, we are not rolling it out anymore. Until we have proper impact assessments done, we're not going to roll out this tech. So what we can then maybe talk about is what measures are these private sector companies suggesting be incorporated prior to rollouts of FRT, which is again interesting because they can sort of suggest to us best practices before any rollouts in the public sector world, which is frankly all of us, where all of us are targets like we are already. One key tool that has come up is obviously doing an impact assessment in terms of doing rigorous trials, finding trial and error to identify whether the system is resulting in a biased matching or not. And by doing so, you are able to identify what are the error rates, if there are any significant error rates, if there are significant problems in terms of obviously racial and ethnic biases that are accidentally or perversely built into the system that you ought to check for prior to that identification being the determiner for taking any action. So I think that impact assessment is a critical part of the exercise that the private sector shows us that ought to be done at least prior to rolling out this kind of really significantly invasive technology in the public sphere. The second thing is obviously to continuously check as to how are we using the technology. So are you going to use FRT as the single determiner for taking any decisions, or is that just going to be one in a matrix of factors that ought to be considered before you, let's say, press the button, right? So is it going to be simply that the system has returned a yes and that's it, there's no further human intervention in the process? Or is it going to be that we recognize that human intervention is still key, and so even if there is going to be an erroneous match, you still have the ability for a human override in this entire process? And I think the latter approach is obviously the far more desirable one, largely because human intervention is actually built into the process from the start. Because like we've already spoken about it, the threshold for identifying what is going to be or what is not going to be a match is again determined. It's not something that the AI or whatever technology is there is automatically deciding for itself. Like a person is going to sit and say, okay, 70% match is a good enough match. And if that is the case, having any sort of framework where the FRT answer is the final answer is a hugely problematic one. So in that regard, I think the experience of the private sector is quite informative, and so far as the United States goes. When you look at it from the Indian perspective, again, it brings us back to the completely opaque, non-transparent setting of FRT in India, where if you were to look at the available material around who is developing FRT and who is supplying it, you have some Indian players where it's not very clear as to whether they are actively providing that technology to the government. Are they doing it exclusively? Are they doing it in partnership with other firms across the world? If they are developing it, then what kinds of impact assessments are they running into their development models to make sure that the error rates and the biases are managed? All of that is completely behind a black shroud, and you just don't know what is the tech even that the government is using on its models, and which is complete contrast to the kind of best practices that you would expect any organization, let alone the government, adopt before it rolls out this kind of technology on a mass level, like on a citywide level.
Yeah, thank you so much, Abhinav. That actually brings me back now to public uses of FRT, where I think we've talked about how UK was one of the countries that's been doing it for a long time, and then US is one of the countries that's doing it in a slightly different sector because you're doing it in the private sector. But if you look at FRT usage in UK, and London is one of, I think, the most surveilled city. It is the most surveilled city in the world almost. But you can see that even with their regulation, even if they've had some time to try to figure it out, right now there's a lot of protests happening. There's a lot of conversation around banning, say, live use of facial recognition. And there's been a lot of conversation generally around how even their facial recognition laws and technology, it's not working. Same problems as you've talked about, how there's bias that's creeping in, the identification software isn't working, there's certain people who are targeted more than others. And there have been some conversations even in this context about having a human in the loop. And then, of course, there's a problem that humans in the loop of an AI mechanism often end up just rubber stamping the decisions instead of actually being able to sort of apply their brains and make the system significantly better in any way. So I'm just wondering, these are, I think, solutions that we're currently considering, or these are part of the solutions we may be considering in India right now. But even in other places where you've applied these solutions, they haven't really worked out. FRT by itself still remains problematic even in these countries. So does that mean that 5 years from now, we'll be in the situation that UK is in, say, today?
No, that's a really interesting and troubling question. I don't think we'll be where UK is today for many reasons, but I think we'll probably be in a slightly worse off situation where the regulation is going to be even poorer than the poor regulation that you have in the UK. Having said that, I should make clear one thing. I'm actually personally not very clear as to what is my stance on whether FRT per se is a good thing or a bad thing, right? In the sense that technology and using technology to solve crime, there are umpteen number of examples which I have seen in my personal and professional life where technology can actually help. Like a very close friend who I'm going to narrow down the field by giving this example, happens to also be a very good athlete and a lawyer, was once extremely troubled after a run where he or she had lost a very very important personal belonging. It just so happened that the run was in Lutyens, Delhi, which is probably one of the most surveilled districts of India. And when they went to the control center for the CCTVs, the CCTV could track the entire run of this person from start to finish, from every angle possible. And that is how they found that critical piece of personal belonging that they had lost. It was still there, and they could see it in real time. So tech helps, right? It's not that it can't help. I think it's just a question of how we are using it and for what purposes. And there, whatever the record has been in the last 7 years since Puttaswamy, since the recognition of privacy within the Indian constitutional landscape, and with, let's say, the more recent developments around the Personal Data Protection Act, the in the upcoming broadcasting bill, the telecom bill, you name it, it's not a very happy series of regulations, where I think the legislative model that has clearly appealed to the current dispensation at the center is make thin laws, but make laws that have seriously high levels of delegated legislation involved with them, which essentially means that the law is nothing but a framework, and everything of substance within that skeleton is going to be put in outside of Parliament, which is not really again the way in which a transparent legislative framework at the minimum threshold level is going to work. So I'm not sure as to whether we'll be as bad as the UK, because I'm worried that we might be worse off when it comes to those issues. What we could probably at least look at the UK and implement is, after the litigation around the usage of live FRT and even the current campaigning which is around live FRT, I think the UK is showing us that the FRT conversation has a lot of nuance and a lot of, there are a lot of shades to it. So you may, let's say, want to introduce it for serious crime. You may not allow it for all sorts of things, which then takes you to the question of the databasing that you are relying upon to do the FRT exercise. So let's say have a database of people who are, accused of crimes involving explosives and are on the run, so that you can run it against that database. But don't also have a database of everyone who has even had any sort of traffic infraction, which then basically means that all of us are permanently under the watch of Big Brother. So I think that level of nuance is something that is emerging over the last 5 years or 6 years in the UK's context. Again, we don't have a very promising history in the last 7.5 years in dealing with the right to privacy. So I'm not sure if we'll ever get to that level of nuance either, but one can be hopeful.
I think the point that you make on one can be hopeful is a good way to maybe approach using FRT for sure, but keeping in mind that we can't rely entirely on hope, and even just the use of FRT and live FRT in particular. Does it make sense to continue to use it, or does it make sense to use it at all? In this case, you've pointed to how it can be beneficial, or should the approach be that we shouldn't have it used in certain contexts, maybe?
I think the sad news there is, from at least my limited experience, is that we have these conversations at a point when we are so far ahead of the bridge that you can't even see it as a small speck in the rear view mirror anymore. Like, the bridge is gone. The bridge, for all you know, never existed in the first place, because you are so far ahead of the river. And that's, I think, where we are on FRT even today, because I think we are way past the stage of suggesting that, cease FRT's usage and whatever, stop any of that. Because for all you know, that databasing has been going on for 25 years. It has achieved a level of sophistication which we frankly have no idea about, because the government can keep everything under wraps and just keep obfuscating any issue that it feels like it. And frankly, there is a level of, there is a significant catchment within public opinion and also within the enforcement agencies that we want this technology. And if that's the case, you're not really seeing a situation where any sort of rollback is going to be possible. I think the only legitimate expectation is to push and push and push to get better regulation in place, to get more transparency in place, and to ensure that at least when it comes to critical decision making, it is not that any person's civil liberties are being infringed purely on the basis of that technology and nothing more. So you can, I would rather say that advocacy that is looking to regulate this technology is probably going to prove more successful than advocacy that is hoping against hope that we sort of roll back this technology until we get the regulation in the first place. I think the experience so far has always been that we've already got the technology. Aadhaar is a wonderfully bad example, but a wonderful example nevertheless of you already have the technology and you then sort of try and figure out how to regulate it better. And if Aadhaar is anything to go by, I think we're going to be probably dealing with a similar fate when it comes to FRT across India.
Yeah, thanks, Abhinav. And I think you've actually pointed to a pretty crucial factor here, and that is the fact that when I was talking about the UK, you can see that in different countries around the world, there's actually a lot of public will that's turned against the use of FRT, and that's kind of why you're having this. So I think in India, there are, of course, a lot of people who recognize that there are policy challenges and they're tackling that front. There are people like you who are working on litigation challenges. But like you said, there isn't really a lot of, I think, public will yet, which is a very important factor. And if you don't have that, then it's unlikely that you'll be able to make a lot of, I think, significant sort of changes in this. Do you think that's likely to change? Do you think that if people knew that this would be something that would genuinely impact them very seriously? Or why do you think that's something that we don't have right now? A lot of public will against public FRT.
I think because if you, again, I am a huge cynic on some of these things, but I think on issues, let's say, pertaining to FRT, it's probably because even in respect to privacy infringements, there are just, FRT is, way down the pecking order, where if you were to look at the kinds of stuff about all of us that you can so easily access in the public domain, I think, in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs pyramid that we were to draw in respect to privacy infringements of ordinary Indians, FRT is going to rank somewhere lower than the ability to track our messages, the ability to get basic biometric information, the abilities to get basic financial information about all of us at the click of a button, so on and so forth, and our health data, let's not even go there. So I think also because surveillance at large never saw any big political movement or a public will movement. So I think FRT being some sort of subspecies of general surveillance when it comes to, let's say, the rollout of CCTVs across cities, there was such a wide, lapping up of, and there was such a love affair with CCTV when that technology came out and was rolled out aggressively across cities and across parts of the country. After tier 1 cities, then you basically have a very aggressive CCTV network across all tier cities. And that also gives me a hint as to why probably FRT is not really going to be considered very critically till you have serious problems in terms of either misidentifications or otherwise. And until that happens, until you have this sort of moment, right, where you have either a horrifically mismatched FRT result being at the focus of some completely botched up action on the part of government agencies, I don't think you're going to see any great conversation around FRT itself, because until that point, all of these dangers are either hypothetical. All of these dangers are the dangers for lawyers and policy activists, where we are seeing 10 feet down the road and imagining that all of these problems are going to come up and this is why you should decide right now. But lo and behold, we are the country of having the tech first and thinking about it later. So I think in that fashion, we are definitely not going to be thinking about FRT in the next few years, if history is anything to go by.
Yeah, but I have to admit, I think you may be a cynic, but I've always been a glass half full kind of a person. So I do think that it's nice to see that there are people working on it. It's nice to see that there is in fact a lot more work being done on this than what people think. I think hopefully people who listen to this podcast can also see that there are some very smart people that are working on FRT regulations right now and trying to ensure that we have some sort of a framework in place. So I do think that it might take some time, but it's likely that we'll probably see some positive shift happening over the next couple of years. As you said, there's a couple of case judgments that might be coming up. So I do think, yes, broadly, maybe we can learn from the experiences we've had in other technology that we're currently looking to regulate, and then hopefully apply that here and have some positive change coming quick.
I admire your optimism, and I will try and implement it as well.
Great. On that positive note, thank you so much, Abhinav, for joining us today. We hope
My
that
pleasure.
our listeners will enjoy this conversation.
We would love to hear your thoughts on the episode and your suggestions on what topics you would like us to cover. You can reach out to us through email or find us on our social media. We will link the details of these in the show notes. Lastly, we would like to thank National Law University Delhi for their support in creating the podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast. We look forward to bringing you more content. This podcast is created by Center for Communication Governance at National Law University Delhi. This episode was edited by Gopika.